The misfortune is very varied. Misfortune spreads multiform on earth. Unfolded by the wide horizon, like the rainbow, its colors are as varied as those of this one, at the same time so different and so intimately united. Spread across the wide horizon like the rainbow. How is it that from beauty has derived a type of ugliness, of alliance and peace, a simile of pain? Just as in ethics evil is a consequence of good, in reality sadness is born from joy. Either the memory of past bliss is today's anguish, or the agonies that are stem from the ecstasies that might have been. My given name is Aegeus, I will not say my last name. However, there are no towers in this country more venerable than those of my gloomy mansion. Our lineage has been called a race of visionaries, and in many surprising details, in the character of the family mansion, in the frescoes in the main hall, in the tapestries in the bedrooms, in the reliefs on some pillars in the armory, but above all in the gallery of ancient paintings, in the style of the library, and lastly in the very peculiar nature of the books, there are sufficient elements to justify this belief. The memories of my early years are related to this mansion and its books, of which I will no longer speak. There my mother died. There I was born. But it is useless to say that it had not lived before, that the soul knows no previous existence. Do you deny it? We will not discuss this point. I am convinced, but I do not try to convince. However, there is a memory of ethereal forms, of spiritual and expressive eyes, of musical and sad sounds, a memory that I cannot marginalize, a memory like a shadow, vague, variable, indefinite, wavering, and like a shadow also due to the impossibility of getting rid of it while the light of my reason shines. In that mansion I was born. Awakening suddenly from the long night of what seemed but was not non-existence, to fairy regions, to a palace of imagination, to the strange realms of monastic thought and learning, it is not surprising that he looked at around me with astonished and burning eyes, that I wasted my childhood among books and dissipated my youth in dreams. But it is strange that the years passed and the height of maturity found me still living in the mansion of my ancestors. The paralysis that fell on the sources of my life is amazing, the complete reversal in the character of my most ordinary thoughts is amazing. The realities of the terrestrial world affected me as visions, only as visions, while the strange ideas of the world of dreams, on the contrary, became not the matter of my daily existence, but really my cynical and total existence. Berenice and I were cousins and grew up together in our ancestors' mansion. But we grew up differently, me, sickly, wrapped in sadness, she, agile, graceful, full of strength. His were the walks on the hill, mine, the studies of the cloister, me, living closed in on myself, delivered body and soul to intense and painful meditation, she, wandering without worrying about life, without thinking about the shadows of the road or the silent flight of the black-winged hours. Berenice. I invoke your name, Berenice. And at this sound 1,000 tumultuous memories of the grey ruins are stirred. Ah, vividly her image comes to me, as in her first days of joy and bliss. Oh enchanting and fantastic beauty! Oh sylph in the bushes of Arnheim! Oh, naiad among its fountains! And then everything is mystery and terror, and a story that must not be told. Sickness, a deadly sickness, came upon her like the simoon, and as I watched her the spirit of change swept over her, penetrating her mind, her habits, and her character, and in the subtlest and most terrible manner came to alter even his identity. Oh! The destructive force came and went, and the victim, where was it? I did not know her, or at least no longer recognized her as Berenice. Among the numerous series of diseases caused by that first and fatal one, which unleashed such a horrible revolution in my cousin's moral and physical being, one must mention as the most anguishing and obstinate a kind of epilepsy which frequently ended in catalepsy, a state much like the extinction of life, from which, in most cases, you woke up abruptly and suddenly. Meantime my own disease, for I have been told I ought not to call it another name, my own disease, I say, was growing extremely rapidly, assuming a monomanic character of a new and extraordinary kind, growing stronger with each passing hour. And, finally, he had an incomprehensible ascendancy over me. This monomania, if I have to call it that, consisted in a morbid irritability of those properties of the mind which psychological science designates by the word attention. It is more than likely that I do not explain myself, but I fear, in fact, that there is no possible way of conveying to the intelligence of the ordinary reader an idea of that nervous intensity of interest with which in my case the meditative faculties, not to speak in technical terms, acted and concentrated on the subject. Contemplation of the most common objects in the universe. Reflecting long, tireless hours with your attention fixed on some trivial note, in the margins of a book, or on its typography, to be absorbed for a good part of a summer day in a strange shadow that fell obliquely on the tapestry or on the door, lose myself a whole night observing the calm flame of a lamp or the embers of the fire, dreaming whole days with the perfume of a flower, repeat monotonously a common word until the sound, thanks to the continuous repetition, ceased to arouse in my mind any idea, losing all sense of movement or physical existence, through an absolute and obstinate stillness of the body, long maintained. These were some of the most common and least pernicious extravagances caused by a state of mental faculties, not really unique, but capable of challenging any type of analysis or explanation. But don't get me wrong. Excessive, intense and morbid attention, thus excited by trivial objects in themselves, must not be confused with the tendency to meditate, common to all men, and to which people with a restless imagination indulge in a particular way. Nor was it, as might be supposed at first, a serious situation or an exaggeration of that tendency, but primarily and essentially different. In one case, the dreamer or fanatic, interested in a normally non-trivial object, gradually loses sight of it in a forest of deductions and suggestions that arise from it, until, at the end of a reverie often filled with voluptuousness, the incitamentum or first cause of his meditations completely disappears and is forgotten. In my case, the primary object was invariably trivial, though it acquired, through my disturbed vision, a reflexive and unreal importance. Few if any deductions arose, and those few stubbornly returned to the original object as their center. Meditations were never pleasant, and at the end of the reverie, the first cause, far from being out of sight, had reached that supernaturally exaggerated interest which constituted the primordial feature of the disease. In a word, the faculties that the mind exercised the most in my case were, as I have already said, those of attention, while in the case of the dreamer they are those of speculation. My books, at that time, if they did not really serve to increase the disorder, shared to a large extent, as will be seen, by their imaginative and disconnected character, the peculiar characteristics of the disorder itself. I can recall, among others, the treatise by the Italian nobleman Coelius Secundus Curio, De Amplitudine Beati Regni Dei, The Greatness of God's Holy Kingdom, the great work of St. Augustine, Delaware Civitate Dei, The City of God, and that of Tertullian, De Carne Christi, The Flesh of Christ, whose paradoxical sentence, Mortis est Dei filius, credible est quia ineptum est, id sepultus resurrexit, certum est quia impossible est, occupied for many weeks of useless and painstaking research all my time. Thus, it will be seen that, torn from its balance only by trivial things, my reason resembled that marine rock that Ptolemy Hephaestion tells us about, which firmly resisted the attacks of human violence and the fiercest fury of the waters and of the seas. Winds, but trembled at the mere touch of the flower called asphodel. And although to an inattentive observer it might seem beyond any doubt that the alteration produced in Berenice's moral condition by her unfortunate illness would have provided me with many subjects for the exercise of that intense and abnormal meditation, the nature of which has cost me much time to explain, without however this was not the case. In the lucid intervals of my illness, I felt sorry for Berenice's calamity, and, deeply moved by the total ruin of her beautiful and sweet life, I did not stop meditating frequently, bitterly, on the prodigious mechanisms by which she had come to be. Such a sudden and strange revolution could take place. But these reflections did not share the idiosyncrasies of my illness, and were like those that would have occurred, in similar circumstances, to common mortals. Faithful to her own character, my disturbance was reveled in the less important but more striking changes produced in Berenice's physical constitution, in the strange and frightful distortion of her personal identity. In the brightest days of her incomparable beauty I did not love her. In the strange anomaly of my existence, my feelings never came from the heart, and my passions always came from the mind. In the misty dawns, in the intertwined shadows of the forest at noon, and in the silence of my library at night, she had floated before my eyes, and I had seen her, not as the living, pulsating Berenice, but as the Berenice of a dream, not as a dweller on earth, but as its abstraction, not as something to admire, but to analyze, not as an object of love, but as the subject of the most abstruse yet disjointed speculation. And now I trembled in his presence and turned pale when he approached. Nevertheless, bitterly lamenting his decline and ruin, I remembered that he had loved me for a long time, and that, in an unlucky moment, I spoke to him of marriage. And when the date of our marriage finally drew near, one winter afternoon, on one of those unseasonably warm, calm, and misty days that make up the beautiful Alshin's nurse, I was sitting, and I thought I was alone, in the inner cabinet of the library, and looking up, I saw Berenice before me. Was it my excited imagination, the influence of the misty atmosphere, the uncertain twilight of the chamber, the grey garments that enfolded her figure, that gave her so wavering and indefinite an outline? I couldn't say. She didn't say a word, and I for nothing in the world could have uttered a syllable. An icy chill ran through my body. I was oppressed by a feeling of insufferable anxiety. A devouring curiosity invaded my soul, and, leaning back in my chair, I remained breathless for a while, motionless, with my eyes fixed on his person. Oh! His thinness was extreme, and not the slightest trace of his former self showed in a single contour line. My burning gaze finally fell on her face. The forehead was high, very pale, and strangely serene. What had once been jet-black hair fell partly over her forehead and shaded her sunken temples with innumerable curls of gleaming blonde, jarringly in contrast, in their fantastic hue, with the melancholy of her face. His eyes were dull and seemed pupilless, and I involuntarily dodged his glassy gaze to contemplate his lips, thin and contracted. They parted, and in a smile of peculiar expression the teeth of the unknown Berenice slowly revealed themselves to my eyes. Would to God that he had never seen them, or that, after seeing them, he would have died. The sound of a door closing distracted me, and looking up, I discovered that my cousin had left the room. But from the disordered chambers of my brain, alas! The white and horrible specter of the teeth had not emerged and could not be removed. There was not a speck on its surface, not a shadow on the enamel, not a dent on its edges in the teeth of that fleeting smile that was not recorded in my memory. He could see them more clearly now than he had a moment before. Teeth! Teeth! They were here, and there, and everywhere, visible and palpable before me, long, thin, and exceedingly white, with pale lips contracting around it, as at the very moment they had begun to grow. Then came the full fury of my monomania, and I struggled in vain against its strange and irresistible influence. Among the many objects in the external world, he thought only of teeth. I longed for them with a frantic desire. All other concerns and other interests were subservient to that contemplation. They were the only ones that were present to my mental gaze, and in their irreplaceable individuality they became the essence of my intellectual life. I examined them under all aspects. I saw them from all perspectives. I analyzed its characteristics. I studied its peculiarities. I noticed his conformation. I thought of the changes in his nature. I shuddered to attribute to them, in the imagination, a sensible and conscious power and, even without the aid of the lips, a capacity for moral expression. Of Mademoiselle Salle it has been rightly said that tous ses pas étaient de sentiments, and of Berenice I seriously believed that tous ses dents étaient d'idées. Des idées. Ah, this absurd thought destroyed me. Des idées. Ah, that's why I coveted them so desperately. I felt that only its possession could restore my peace, returning my reason. And the afternoon fell on me, and darkness came, lasted, and was gone, and the new day dawned, and the mists of a second night gathered around, and I still sat motionless in that lonely room, and I lay deep in thought, and the ghost of the teeth held its terrible sway, as if, with a vivid and horrible clarity, it floated amidst the changing light and shadow of the room. At last a cry of horror and consternation broke into my dreams, and then, after a pause, the noise of worried voices, mingled with muffled moans of pain and sorrow. I got up from my seat and, opening the doors of the library, I saw in the anteroom a maid, broken down in tears, who told me that Berenice no longer existed. He had suffered an epileptic fit early in the morning, and now, as night fell, the tomb was prepared to receive its occupant, and the burial arrangements completed. I found myself sitting in the library, and again alone. It seemed that he had awakened from a confused and exciting dream. He knew that it was midnight and that Berenice had been buried since sunset. But I had no exact idea, or at least a definite one, of that melancholy intervening period. Yet the memory of that interval was full of horror, horror more horrible for being vague, terror more terrible for being ambiguous. It was a hideous page in the history of my existence, written with sinister, horrifying, unintelligible memories. I struggled to decipher them, but to no avail. Meanwhile, like the spirit of a far-off sound, a shrill piercing woman's cry seemed to ring in my ears. I had done something. But what was it? I asked myself the question aloud, and the whispering echoes of the room answered me. What was it? On the table next to me a lamp was shining, and near it was a small box. It was not conspicuous in appearance, and I had seen it before, as it belonged to the family doctor. But how had it gotten there, on my table, and why did I shudder when I looked at it? These things were not worth considering, and at last my eyes fell on the open pages of a book and on a underlined phrase. They were the strange but simple words of the poet Ibn Zayed, Dispent mihi sodales, Si sepulchrum amici visitum, curas mis aliquantulum for levatas 3. Why, when reading them, did my hair stand on end and my blood freeze in my veins? There was a soft knock at the library door and, pale as a tomb dweller, a servant tiptoed in. There was a hideous terror in his eyes, and he spoke to me in a broken, hoarse, and very low voice. What did he say? I heard some broken sentences. He spoke of a wild scream that had disturbed the silence of the night, and of the servants gathered to find out where it came from, and his voice took on a horrifying tone, of course, when he spoke to me, whispering, of a desecrated grave, of a wrapped corpse. In the shroud and disfigured, but still breathing, still throbbing, still living. He pointed to my clothes, they were stained with mud and blood. I didn't answer anything, took me gently. The hand, it had human fingernail prints. He directed my attention to an object on the wall. I looked at it for a few minutes. It was a shovel. With a cry I ran to the table and grabbed the box. But I could not open it, and by my trembling it slipped out of my hands, and fell to the ground, and broke into pieces, and among these, colliding, rolled some instruments of dental surgery, mixed with 32 tiny white ivory objects, which scattered on the floor.